So if for some reason you missed the memo or you didn't see the sample answer in the course documents section, your answer needs to be longer than the question. Yeah, it really does. Yeah, and I'm not trying to be rude at all, because probably the people that aren't listening anyway. But you know, it does need to be longer than the question. Probably about a page long. Some examples would be good. Also, if I ask you 5 questions, you know, like question 1, there are like 5 different things that I said, hey, discuss this, that, or the other thing. You should consider discussing some of those things. And if I say in a lecture, I'm going to be distressed if you don't talk about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, or possibly the bargain of 1877 in your answer, that's what you should probably talk about. Also, plagiarism. I'm opposed to it. You should be as well. Now, if I send you something that says, hey, it looks like you used information from this site, and it's word for word from that site, and you tell me, no, I was unaware of that site. You might have been unaware of that site. I don't know. Maybe some other site copied that. I don't know. But if your answer is word for word, the same as somebody else's, it's going to be super hard to defend that. And if I send you a link and you don't look at the link, the reason I sent you the link is because it's word for word what you put in your answer. You can't have any of that, even if it's only a paragraph. None, nada, zero, nothing, no, don't do it, okay? I also will try to be fairly lenient as I grade the first couple of weekly questions, but I'm going to put comments on there like, if I were you, I would do this, or maybe consider organizing that. At a certain point, I may, you know, add just some general tips about writing, you know, like it's cool to capitalize things from time to time. And I realize I would never count off about any of the writing errors that you might make, but I may point them out because it's college. And, you know, the farther you get in college, the more, I don't know the professional, but academic, that's probably a good word, your writing should appear. So, you know, you want to capitalize proper nouns, you want punctuation, that sort of stuff. And it's not an English class, not counting off of that kind of stuff, but I may start mentioning that because it seems to be a little bit of an issue. And I'm not, again, this is not formal writing. You're not turning in a big paper. When you do the book review, you know, that stuff is going to be a problem. But on your weekly assignments, when you turn them in, you know, try to use proper grammar and capitalization. Again, not the biggest deal. And if you want to write 3 pages, feel free. I mean, you get excited about something, you just keep going. That's fine. But, but all right. So I don't want to scold anymore, but oh my goodness. And there are things, you know, that I'm reading, like somebody wrote that the North's main crop was cotton. It's like, oh gosh, no. And you know, just, we do need for you to be right. It's a history class, so we like for people to be factually accurate. So, and you know, somebody was talking about how like 2 days after Johnson was impeached, Grant became president because they were so mad at Johnson. That's not how that works. You know, maybe you're mad at Trump, but we're not replacing him tomorrow. We have regular elections, and we always have. So, and Johnson didn't get kicked out of office, if I wasn't very clear about that. He finished serving. But, you know, we've always pretty much had regular elections, and yeah, the only time people leave early is if they die or you're Nixon, and then you leave early. We'll talk about him later. All right, we should talk about today's stuff. So, yeah, and honestly, if you go longer on your work, as long as what you're saying is good, that's cool. Oh, also about the book, because a couple of you mentioned that the online book, the 5th edition, is no longer free or available. I'll take your word for that. I didn't check. And then somebody else said, no, you can get the new one online for free. You just need your ACC ID. And then someone else said, no, that only works for 21 days. Honestly, no idea. I really don't know. But if it only works for 21 days, at least get it for 3 weeks until your other book comes in. Because a couple of you have been saying, like, my book never came. Well, go get the free one for 21 days. The other one, somebody sent a link, and you can download that thing as a PDF. I know that's not the most convenient thing, but it's better than no book. You know what I'm saying? All right. Back with
If I might,
please, go ahead.
yeah, sorry for interrupting. You can also get a digital rental copy online for a fairly decent price.
Okay.
So that's what I ended up doing. So it's weird having a digital rental. It's kind of strange for me, but I was able to get the textbook first day in
Okay.
the middle of class, just logging into Amazon real quick.
Oh, that's handy. And is it probably like 20 bucks or something? 20,
I think it was like 35, nearly
30. Okay.
40, but
Yeah.
it was a decent price.
All right. That sounds good. That sounds helpful. And even if you're broke, do the PDF version or the 21-day free rental, or it's not free, it's not a rental, but the trial. But do something. You got to have a book. You just have to. Sorry. Um, I was thinking back when I went to college 100 years ago, books were more expensive than tuition. That's not true anymore. But also minimum wage was $2.85. So it took a long time to save money for $500 worth of books. Okay, and then yeah, somebody's saying in the chat they can send current chapters, and also that PDF thing. If you want to download that, it's even I did it accidentally. So there you go. All right. I'm gonna remind us what the weekly question is because I just can't remember. I know that it's about Native Americans, by the way. Oh, somebody answered that already. And yeah, the answer was okay and then odd also. All right, sorry. Sharing the screen. Where to go? There it is. All right. So, discuss the experiences of Native Americans in the Gilded Age. Be sure to include the Dawes Act. I'm not kidding about that. Be sure to include the Dawes Act in this discussion. And that's not the Dawes Act that happens later on where we financed Germany's war debt from World War I. That's a whole different Dawes Act. This is the Dawes Act that has to do with Native Americans. So if you're Googling stuff, you don't need to Google it. Just look it up in the book, right? How does the emergence of the ghost dance reflect the experiences of the Indians? So when you talk about the ghost dance, tell me what it is when you talk about it and what was the significance of Wounded Knee. So, and we'll talk about all this stuff today. Also, just a little aside, I think, I don't even know how to say this without being, it's never my goal to be offensive, but political correctness and what do we call people and what is appropriate and that sort of thing. Okay, we'll have this talk on occasion. So since we're having a Native American question, we're having this talk. Okay, Native American, that always works. So if you're talking about a specific tribe and you know the tribe's name, that works. Indian, that was kind of out and now it's sort of back in, although American Indian is probably better because it's lots of immigrants from India. One of my very favorite students got a degree in engineering and then got a job at some plant. He was, kind of the management level at some manufacturing plant in West Virginia. And one of the people asked him like, hey, you got a funny name. What are you? Like, what is your ethnicity? And he said he was Indian. He is definitely from India. And they said, what tribe? So, I mean, there's that. So you may want to say American Indian. For a while, you didn't say Indian. Now you can. American Indian's probably more precise. Native American works nicely. Names of tribes are good. But this is not so bad. Also, it's kind of when you talk about blacks and whites, do you capitalize black and white? Just do the same for both is what I would do if I were you. I would say don't capitalize either. But those are old grammar rules, that kind of stuff. But just if you capitalize one, capitalize both. All right, I'm done talking about that for now. It'll come back up later though. It will, yeah. All right. And the notes. Let me find those. My goodness. You guys had a weird morning. It's only 10:30. How could, yeah. It's too many
It's been a pretty weird couple weeks, actually.
Yeah, it's been a stupid year, to be honest. Yeah. This year just needs to be over, and then we'll try again next year. But, all right. But I hope things are going well for you. I'm not trying to be cranky. All right. We need to talk about Turner's thesis. Now, typically, I didn't do it this time for your quiz, but typically on a test, like if I gave you my full length test, which would be 40 multiple choice questions and an essay, there would be a question about Frederick Jackson Turner. There's not on your quiz, so I'm not, making a big hint here. But the reason is Frederick Jackson Turner was a historian and he made history. We so rarely do that. So he analyzed the 1890 census data and determined that the United States was full, that we had pretty much settled everything from the east to the west. Now, if you, like, I went to college, my undergrad was in San Angelo at Angelo State University, or as one of my professors liked to call it, the Mecca of knowledge, which indeed it was. But if you've been there, the country is not full. I mean, nobody lives there. And if you go between there and Lubbock, there's a whole bunch of places where nobody lives. And I've heard in Montana, nobody lives there. In Wyoming, I haven't been to those either. But what he meant is there wasn't a part of the United States that hadn't been settled to a certain extent. So that period of exploration and taming the West and that sort of thing was over. And a lot of people associated that constant exploration, moving westward, finding new land, to be part of the greatness that was the United States. So there was a concern that the United States would no longer be great because we no longer had a frontier. This also is going to spur us to want to take over other lands that might be, I don't know, adjacent to the United States, and of course to take more land away from Native Americans. And in our weekly question, I don't know that you even need to say, like, this was a bad time for Native Americans, because in looking at U.S. history, what exactly was the good time for Native Americans? I mean, maybe briefly in early colonization where everybody's getting along pretty well. Native Americans outnumber the new settlers and trade is fairly beneficial for them. But once they catch smallpox and the flu and get pushed west, it's just not as good, and it doesn't get any better. But anyway, okay. So westward expansion is going to increase during this time period. Farmland in the east that was productive is expensive, or some of the land has been kind of worn out by certain crops. Tobacco apparently is a really hard crop on the soil. And then if you're anything else you're growing too, we had figured out a long time ago that you need to rest part of your field. So crop rotation is kind of an important thing, but not everybody practiced it. So sometimes the land got worn out, or if it was really productive, it was too expensive. So you just moved farther west and you either purchased land or you kind of took somebody else's land and claimed it as your own. So we'll see a lot of that during this time period and before, of course. So westward expansion increases during the Gilded Age to the detriment of Indian nations and people of Latino descent who already lived there. The parts that used to be Mexico. Yeah, one of my friends was telling me this weekend, I went to soccer, and they were saying, yeah, somebody came up to talk to me, they were upset. I know who it was my niece. She was upset because she'd gone to the store and the cashier didn't speak Spanish and the customer did, and he was an older fellow and he was confused about something. So my niece translated something, and the person behind him said, like, if you don't speak English, you should go back to your country. And my niece said, well, quite frankly, this used to be Mexico, and my guess is you aren't from Mexico, so maybe you should go back to your country. I'm sure that wasn't the best conversation she ever had, but
I like it.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was saying I like it.
it was, it was a bold move on my niece's part, and a good reflection of her knowledge of history, which I'm always glad to see. But I don't know, you shouldn't be mean to somebody who's already confused. Poor older fella, he couldn't figure out how much money he needed to pay. But back to this. So, this is the era where the United States is kind of claiming, pushing people off of land that used to be Mexico. And there are reasons people went west. So usually when we talk about people going west, we group them into 3 different groups: farmers, ranchers, and miners. So, to keep consistent on that, I'll do that, and you'll notice the 3 bullet points. So we'll go over that pretty quickly, and then we'll hit the Native American thing. Sorry that I'm scrolling, not trying to make it easy. We'll hit the Native American thing a little harder. And we may review.
I can't see what you're sharing.
Oh no, thanks for telling me, and cried. Let me try again, sorry. Are there,
I didn't think anything of it until about 2 seconds ago.
Okay, thanks for mentioning it. And yeah, ASU Angelo State University. Woo, Golden Rams. Okay, let me try to share again. Old people in technology, that's all I can say. Cried. Well, now I don't see it at all. Maybe it doesn't exist. Cried. All right.
Yeah, you had it up and then kind of brought it down for the discussion, and then.
Oh, I forgot to put it back up, didn't I? Yeah. And then I closed it, which is why it's not there. Okay. Try again. Goodness. I know I've already told you my dad, who's 80, makes fun of my technology skills. He is correct. Boy, you guys are so nice to each other, wanting to share the books and stuff. Okay, now I'll share the notes. I'll try to be nice too. Okay. I'm hoping you can see this. Goodness. All right. So here we go, the bullet points. Oh, and that was the guy I talked about, Frederick Jackson Turner, who I'm not asking you questions about, but we'll probably bring him back up in the next chapter where we start talking about, we're more neighbors. So people went west, mostly to get land or money. Farming was a nice reason to go west. Millions of families moved west because of the Homestead Act. Crud, I don't think I even asked a question about the Homestead Act, which is fairly important, but it's tricky because I got to limit what I can ask questions about. So, Homestead Act, that gives away free land in the West, or cheap land. You may have had to pay like $5 an acre to register it. And one of the tricks, it's definitely a trick, when we took over the land from Mexico, most of the people who owned the land, of course, were from Mexico, and they'd filed for titles in Mexico City because, it's the capital of Mexico. Well, now that those lands weren't Mexico anymore, those titles weren't valid. So what the United States did is gave title to whoever came and filed at the land offices for title. So the people who had owned it for generations didn't realize they needed to go file. Or, they may have sent notices in English, which they may or may not have been able to read. And they probably didn't send notices at all because, we didn't mail as much. And printing was expensive. So maybe they posted a sign. Maybe they just assumed they would know. But whatever happened, a bunch of white guys filed for title and got the land away. That's how the King family got the King Ranch. So at least that's what I recall from my very tiny bit of Texas history, because I wasn't raised in Texas. All right, so farming. Millions of people go west because the land's cheap. Now, I always like to point out that when you see free land in the West, and you're thinking like, if I'm a poor guy in the East, man, I'm taking advantage of the free land. If you're a poor guy in the East, you're not taking advantage of the free land because you can't even afford the trip out to get the free land. And you can't afford the provisions that the 3-month trip is going to take. So poor guys rarely benefit from these kind of laws or actions. It's usually middle-class guys, middle-class guys. Rich guys, as a rule, don't leave unless they're really super entrepreneurial, like I'm rich, but I could be even richer in the West. usually rich guys are, you know, they're pretty happy. So usually it's middle-class guys that are doing this kind of stuff because it's an opportunity that they don't have in the East and they can afford to take advantage of it. You don't need to be wealthy, but you need to have some resources. But anyway, so they go west. Typically, whenever we're giving away land, for whatever reason, the magic amount of land, and the truth is I don't really know why, is 160 acres. Now, I do know enough about farming to know that unless you're growing organic broccoli, 160 acres is not enough. So if you're planting crops, you need lots more acreage than that. I grew up in Missouri and then graduated from high school in northern Missouri, which is just a giant corn or wheat field. And those farms were thousands of acres. They were really big. You know, nobody lives there. So you might as well plant some crops, something like that. So 160 acres, typically not enough, and especially not in the West, where the soil may not be consistently good. You don't have enough rain, that sort of stuff. So you need a bigger farm. So what typically happened is people would go west, get their 160 acres, and they'd get an additional 80 for like each kid or something like that. Still wasn't big enough because you'd have to have like 100 kids, but their farms were never quite big enough. So the more successful farmers typically bought the farmland from the less successful farmers. But the less successful farmers typically stayed in the West, even though they didn't keep their farms. If you're wondering, what did they do? Not farm. They became like the store owner, or they mostly stores. Because you know, you don't really have a lot of restaurants or things like that. So you have your businesses are going to be stores, and maybe stores. You might fix stuff as well. You might put shoes on horses, although that's a little more of a Southwestern kind of thing. But people opened businesses and eventually maybe became teachers or lawyers, that sort of stuff, as towns developed around those farms. So, or in the middle of those farms. So, all right. So most of the people, millions of people move west this way. Most of them don't stay farmers, but about a third of them do, and some of them become fabulously wealthy. There could be money in farming. There still is now. It's a little more corporate, but farming. So successful farms, thousands of acres, and the book also talks about them being modern farms with new equipment, which is expensive. It's expensive. So people would have to finance that sort of thing. And also, to be a good farmer, you would have to be educated. You would have to know. They don't really do pesticides yet, but they did, you know, apply certain natural things that would help destroy pests that typically grew. Now, if you have just a whole swarm of grasshoppers that come in, there's nothing you can do about that. And that did happen from time to time. But, you know, you had to be up on what to plant and when to plant it, and what, you know, this crop, excuse me, takes this nutrient out of the soil. So you want to partner this crop with that crop that puts that nutrient back into the soil. I mean, it's, you know, there's a lot of science to this. Clearly, I don't know any of it, even though I do maybe come from a generation or two back. Some farmers, mostly I just kill plants. But farming, very important. We need food. Okay. They also are going to get frustrated with ranchers because there's a period, 20, 30-year period, 1860s to maybe 1880s, where ranching is open range. So you don't really necessarily own, I mean, you own some ranch land and you raise your cattle there, but when you drive them to market, you just literally have a cattle drive and you drive them to market, and you just go through the open farmland. So it's not really good for the farmers when the ranchers take their cattle, drive their cattle through the farmland. So once they invent barbed wire, then people in the West put up fencing around their farms. And by West, we're not talking like completely to the West, but maybe Oklahoma West, you know, Oklahoma to what we think of as the West. Because those The Midwestern part of the Great Plains, sorry for the giant yawn in the middle of my own lecture, really good farmland. So we're talking Oklahoma, Kansas, parts of Arkansas, Missouri, Nebraska. I hear they grow corn there. And if you're wondering to yourself, why did they not just build a fence like I have at my house with those weird cedar planks that everybody seems to have here? Well, because if you've ever been to the Great Plains, you've noticed there's no trees. There's no trees. So they don't have anything to make the fence out of. That's why barbed wire is so important on the Great Plains, because it's expensive just to have the fence post. So, and they make barbed wire that's Joseph Glidden. I don't know why historians know stuff like that. Joseph Glidden from Illinois. Yeah. All right. Do you guys have any? You don't care about do you care about barbed wire? You would if you ran into it. It hurts, by the way. I can remember going to, I know you want to know this, the soccer field in Bastrop when my husband and I first started coaching soccer. It was a long time ago. And I don't know why Bastrop had a soccer league, because they didn't really have a soccer field. So this place in the middle of a ranch, some ranches and farms, they had barbed wire on the edge. And if you went too close, if you didn't stop soon enough, the soccer players would run into barbed wire, which is not really funny, even though. All right, ranching. You guys already know about ranching. Do I need to tell you? No. It's Texas. You all have a ranch, but ranching is much more of a southwestern. Well, I shouldn't say that because they have ranches in Montana and Wyoming, but it's a western thing. Ranch owners tend to make quite a bit of money from this. Ranchers make some money from this. And this is more of a dude thing. I didn't mention, sorry for scrolling back. Farming, that's families. People go west with their families. Ranching, that's guys, except the ranch owners, and those are families. And if you're wondering, were there any women ranchers? Yeah, there probably were. I'm not trying to be disrespectful to the women ranchers. But this is primarily a dude thing. Also, if you look at statistics and people, kept records of everything, this is probably a very integrated type of profession, not necessarily intentionally. It just was like, ranchers didn't go like, you know what, I really think we should equally hire Black and Hispanic employees, but it's the Southwest. So you got a lot of guys of Mexican descent. And ranching is a very Mexican thing and Latin American thing. And you also have a lot of African American guys in the West, because these are guys whose best career option, am I echoing or is that okay? But these are guys whose best career option is
Someone should turn the mic off.
Okay, that's probably it. Okay, maybe you may have told them. Good job. Okay. Back to guys going to the West. African Americans are joining the military because it's probably one of their best career options during that era. Now, I'm not even going to try to suggest to you anything untrue. There's no way blacks and whites were treated equally in the military during this time period. And this is also the era where they talked about Buffalo Soldiers, because lots of African Americans are stationed in the West, and their primary job is to keep Native Americans on their reservations. And Native Americans referred to African American soldiers as Buffalo Soldiers. They typically got the worst assignments, underpaid, that sort of stuff. But once your time in the military was over, once you did not re-enlist, you may stay in the West and work on a ranch. And that was not unusual. So, lots of ranch hands, again, Black or Hispanic, Mexican typically. All right. Same deal with the ranch land that was given away by the federal government, tended to be 160-acre plots. Typically, ranchers would get their employees to go and register for extra land and add it to the ranches. Less discrimination in this industry because you got to have ranch hands, and you're not going to treat them differently because you need them to do what you need them to do. And the work crew is pretty small, so they typically are going to work fairly well together. Plus, it's a dangerous job, so you got to have each other's back, literally, or you're going to die. So I do think sometimes people portray ranchers in this time period in literature and film, although honestly, I don't watch a lot of movies, and I definitely haven't seen any movies about ranching. Are there movies about ranching? But from I have read some stuff, and they do portray ranchers as like really wild, out of control dudes that are drunk a lot, and that really just doesn't fit well with the job. I mean, it doesn't. You can't, especially on cattle drives. You absolutely better be sober, because cows aren't that smart. So keeping them in line is hard. You got to be sober to do that, apparently. So now, once the cattle are at market and maybe everybody's gotten paid, maybe people, are festive at that point. But typically, it's just a hard job. All right, dangerous working conditions. Things improve with the invention of barbed wire. Also, because then you don't have to go on the cattle drive. And what you end up doing, what you end up doing is buying the grain from the farmer whose farm you typically trampled on the cattle drive. So this actually helps farmers and ranchers once they fence in both. So you buy the grain, your cows get fatter. Apparently the cattle get kind of lean and muscular on the cattle drive, or they fall off cliffs, but mostly lean and muscular, which apparently is not good for steak. So, all right. So things improve for both ranchers and farmers, and the industries become more settled and more profitable. And the railroad thing mixing in with those is really helpful too, especially once they have refrigerated cars. Before they have refrigerated cars, you just put the cows on a train and ship them to market. Once the open range closed. Once you have the refrigerated cars, you put the remains of the cow on the train. Also, if you ever hear about range wars, that's cattle ranchers and sheep ranchers usually fighting over grazing land. Yeah. I don't know much about this, even though I went to Angelo State, where they do talk about ranching quite a bit. And San Angelo is the sheep capital of the world. I don't think that's really, but I think that they advertise it as such. But here's what I know, the very little I know about sheep. They're not even as smart as cows, no offense to either sheep or cows, who I'm sure are listening to this lecture right now. But apparently when the sheep graze, they pull up the grass and eat the roots, and the cows just eat the grass. Okay, all right, sheep are yummy, or are the cows yummy? I don't know which, but anyway. So the sheep permanently destroy the grazing land because they pull up whatever they're grazing on, grass typically, and they eat the roots as well. The cattle just eat the grass and don't pull up stuff and eat the roots. So you did actually have cattle and sheep ranchers shooting at each other, my goodness, in West Texas and eastern New Mexico, where you saw a lot of that. Yeah. San Angelo, before it was the Mecca of knowledge, perhaps. I don't know. All right, and mining. And we'll take a break after mining, and I'll see if you have any questions. Mining, you know what mining is, where you dig a hole and look for metals of some sort, mostly dig a hole. You could do that placer mining thing where you have something that looks like a pie pan and you just shake it out and you hope when you're done there's little pieces of gold in it or something. You see that in movies. And people did do that. I mean, you didn't have enough money to dig giant holes to look for metals. Okay, so the mining we're talking about typically is gold and silver mining. And this happens some in the West, California, Colorado, North Dakota, and Alaska. Alaska, which that's west, I suppose, and very north. The Klondike gold rush is a little later. I think it's 1890s. But you gotta have money to go up there. Yeah. Typically, mining companies are the ones who profit from this activity. There'll be thousands of dudes. This is definitely a guy kind of thing. And these guys tend to be pretty rowdy. That's, all the rowdiness that you see in Western movies and novels. It's probably fair to attribute some of this to guys that go west to mine. But mining companies will go and they'll try to locate areas where they can find gold or silver. They don't really have good technology to do this. The one thing they do when they dig the holes, or try to find the caves or whatever, clearly I don't know enough about mining, is they use water cannons really to clear the soil, and it leads to some fairly impressive erosion. And local communities, once they begin to grow, will pretty quickly pass laws against using the water propelled drills to mine, because it's so hard on the soil. So you'll see people in the West being environmental pretty early without really, their intention may or may not be in a environmental sense in the modern way of thinking about it, but it's about the water and the soil. Those things are the lifeblood of, well, anybody really, but especially in the West, because you're either growing stuff, especially in California and the coastal West Coast states, or you're ranching, and some of these places don't get rain very often, and you need the water and you need the soil to be pretty solid. So anything that harms the environment becomes more of a problem, it seems, in the West than in the East pretty quickly, and is more protected in the West than the East at an earlier time. But okay. So thousands of men, handful of mining companies go to the West. There'll be a handful of people that become amazingly wealthy because of mining. Gold in California, 1848, so it leads to the 49ers, which of course is a football team, so that helps you remember. In Colorado, the silver rush, Pikes Peak, that sort of stuff, is 59, and there's some sports team that's called the Colorado 59ers, but I think it's a lower level. It could be baseball, it might even be soccer, I don't know, I don't think it's soccer. But the Black Hills in North Dakota, that's a whole Custer sort of thing. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, but part of the reason Custer wants to be stationed where he was stationed is because they found gold in the Black Hills of North Dakota, which that area had become, it's where they had consolidated Native Americans, had become into, consolidated, that's not the right word, is it? But contained, put them on a reservation. And that was considered sacred ground to them, hunting and burial grounds, and a whole bunch of people came in to mine the gold. That's going to lead to a fairly distinct conflict. And the Klondike region, you just got to want to go up there because that's a trip, and there's nobody in Alaska and it's dangerous, that kind of thing. And that could potentially lead to a lot of money for a handful of people. But it does kind of lead them to discover oil, so that's important as well. Leads to millions of people moving to California. California, I think, it's populated faster than any other state. I think when they applied for statehood, they had like 50,000 people because that's what you required. And within the next 6 months, I think they grew to 1 million. So they have really rapid population because everybody wanted to get rich. And who can blame them? Getting rich, it sounds fun. A rapid statehood, influx of immigrants and migrants to Indian lands in the Northwest. So this is going to lead to lots of people from the East going to the West, plus natives from overseas, or excuse me, immigrants from overseas as well. So Native Americans are going to get a whole bunch of new neighbors during this time period, and none of it is helpful to them. Will lead to the Great Sioux Wars, which is in those are the North Dakota Wars, and other armed conflicts. So 3 main reasons people go west: farming, ranching, mining. Farming, families; ranching and mining, dudes. If you're wondering, do single women go to the West? Maybe. Single women typically don't go anywhere by themselves during this era. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but sometimes they go to the West to, we'll say, be entertainers. Sometimes they go to the West to do, household cleaning and cooking and that kind of stuff near ranching and mining camps. But also, those saloons and dance halls, they were a thing. And they weren't just drinking and dancing there as well. They sold other entertainment services, shall we say. All right, so we'll stop sharing for just a minute, and I will see if you have any questions you would like to ask. Do you have any questions you would like to ask? While I'm waiting for just a second, I'm also peeking at the roll. So,
No, you did a pretty good explanation.
oh, thanks. I appreciate that.
I was gonna say I'm just kind of soaking everything in.
Okay. Yeah, and I don't know if you've noticed, but generally my lectures are kind of general. That's my goal. And the specifics are in the textbook. So I think sometimes it's helpful to read the textbook before the lecture, but I know you may or may not have time. And the lecture is a little more of an overview, I suppose. All right. I'm peeking at the roll just a little bit more, and then we'll go on. And before we go, I may just ask, like, hey, are you here? I still have to get a better way to do this. All right. So no questions. You guys are happy. You're happy.
All that was post-Civil War, right?
Yep, definitely post-Civil War. I didn't say dates here, but what's kind of interesting is the Homestead Act, and when Homestead Act, building the Transcontinental Railroad, a lot of this stuff happens in the 1860s, and some of this actually starts during the Civil War. So some of these things are done during the Abraham Lincoln's presidency. Many of them are kind of completed during the Johnson administration. But to me, it's always fascinating. Like, we're buying Alaska, we're starting to plan the Transcontinental Railroad, we're planning the Homestead Act. We're doing a lot of stuff during the Civil War. Because I do think we sometimes just think, well, all we could concentrate on was the Civil War. No. But we did a lot of stuff, which I think is moderately interesting. All right. Anybody else have anything they want to say before we go back to the notes? And hopefully I'll remember how to share them, because it's been 30 seconds since I did it. I only teach 3 classes a day. You would think I would remember, right? Okay, Native Americans. So our question is about Native Americans. How did things go for them? And some specifics about the Dawes Act. So we'll talk specifically about the Dawes Act. I would, if I were you, when you're answering this question, put dates in parentheses like that. So when you talk about the Dawes Act, put 1887 in the date. When you talk about, oh crud, I didn't put the date. Sorry for the yawn again, of the ghost dance. So we may have to look that up. But I would also try to talk about stuff in chronological order. So, in the order that stuff happens. So, all right. So Homestead Act is 1860s. So you've got millions of people moving to the West in the 1870s. And there's the intention of the US government in getting white people to move to the West, and they really do want white people to move to the West, is because the US government believes, and I know that I'm personifying the US government, but we're just going to do it for today because it mostly works. People who work for the US government and develop policy for the US government, and pretty much white people in the East, pretty much think that Native Americans are inferior. Now, it's pretty simple during this time period how you decide that someone is inferior. It's because they lose. So if you have a war with someone and you're able to take their land, guess what? They're inferior to you. And that's kind of how we see things, honestly, throughout history. Also, I do want to point out a couple of things really quick, because just some comments that I've seen in some of your, because, that first question about, about Reconstruction, was it successful and was it a failure? or both. And, most of you, of course, are concluding that it's both. I read stuff that you guys write, and it's like, the United States is the most racist country in history, and this is just some evidence of it. Like, I don't know that I'd go with the United States as the most racist country in history. Now, hey, I'm watching the news, and there's some bad stuff going on. I know, and I know, and you're going to learn about more bad stuff in this class. Like, I was watching an interview with Kamala Harris where she's talking about whether she's not sure that she would take the corona vaccine if it comes out. And then somebody's saying, well, there's a history of African American leaders saying they don't trust the white medical establishment. And no kidding. And we'll talk about some reasons that that's true as well. And that's also why a statement from an African American leader that says we don't trust the healthcare system has more of an impact, because historically there are good reasons for people of color, honestly, poor people in general, not to trust the healthcare system, because the government might use the healthcare system to try stuff out on poor people and people of color, because they've done it before. You'll see, and it's documented stuff. It's not like the weird Facebook history sort of stories. One of those books in the book list, the Tuskegee, called Bad Blood, Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, that's going to be a major instance of that. And there are certain things you could read during the eugenics movement, which is like 1920s and 30s in the United States, that if you get put in a mental institution or a prison during that time period, there's a good chance they're trying some stuff out on you. Or they're sterilizing you, especially during the eugenics movement. If we think that you are such a bad person that you're going to commit crimes, or such an unstable person that you have a mental health illness, they may just sterilize you because we don't want any more people like you reproduced, or, we don't want you reproducing. So, and the government has a lot of power to do stuff like that during that time period. But anyway, sorry, I really did digress there, didn't I? But back to what we're supposed to talk about. Oh, sorry. I even have notes and I did that. I apologize. So we have decided as a government that Native Americans are inferior, but they're not bad people. They just don't know stuff yet. So we have to fix them. The way that we can fix Native Americans is to change their culture. And how would you want to change their culture? You would want to make them more like the best culture that you know of, yes, average white guy in the United States culture. So we want to make Native Americans into small farmers, because, even Thomas Jefferson, who was a great guy in many ways, I know in a few other ways he wasn't, but he said this should be a republic of small farmers. So for Native Americans to find true American happiness, they need to be small farmers. Are Plains Indians small farmers? No, they're not small farmers. They chase around buffalo. So they're hunter-gatherer kind of dudes who hunt buffalo and deer too, but buffalo. So what's the best way to change Native American culture and get them to stop hunting buffalo? Kill all the buffalo. Okay. Sounds a little harsh. Definitely not something we do in the modern era. Okay, it is way more than a little harsh, but the U.S. government says we will get rid of the buffalo. So if you're in the military and you're stationed in the West, you get to kill buffalo. Sometimes the government would sponsor buffalo hunts. They would pay hunters to come out to the West, and millions of buffalo were killed in the 1880s. And the herds were essentially eliminated. So the herds that just roamed the plains were no longer there. And that was the goal, the stated goal of part of the US government. That's not like in the presidential platform or anything, but Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Secretary of the Army, these guys are going to talk about ways to get Native Americans under control and more civilized, as they would say. Just one of the early steps is to get rid of the buffalo. So there are going to be plans to do that. And there's also, part of the reason that we're doing all these land giveaways in the West is to get white guys to move to the West, and that will force Native Americans to change their culture, have to stay on reservations, on confined and prescribed areas. So the U.S. government will make treaties with Native American groups. If they don't want to make a treaty, then we'll have a war with Native American groups. And eventually, Native Americans will be confined to reservations. So, let me look at the notes and make sure that I've said everything that I wanted to say so far, and make sure that it's not time to go. So buffalo, Plains tribes use them for food, clothing, shelter, tools, etc. Also, when you had 8th grade U.S. history, you probably had a really nice history teacher who gave you a chart that showed everything that people used, or the Native American tribes used the buffalo for. They really did use every part. I know I had an 8th grade teacher. I taught 11th grade U.S. history, but I had an 8th grade teacher give me one of those charts once, and they used parts of the male buffalo for baby rattles. It's like, that's really weird. But they, to me it was, I know that was judgmental, I'm sorry. But they apparently did really use every part of the buffalo. Truly, they did. Okay. Also distressing to Native Americans that the U.S. government just killed the buffalo and let them rot on the land. So, and there's lots of photos of that. I should find one of those and share it with you next time. Not rotting buffalo, but you see like piles of like buffalo hides and or just buffalo on the ground, and people walking around them, or trains going through them. So anyway, back to business. So putting Native Americans on reservations works fairly well, except during hunting season. That's why getting rid of the buffalo was an important part of this. Okay. Battle of Little Bighorn, Custer's Last Stand. That's about the gold land in the Great Hills of the Dakotas. And this is going to be the one major Native American victory. And this is Sitting Bull, Rain in the Face. Some other folks of the Lakota Sioux tribe, S-I-O-U-X is Sioux, which is a sign there were some French people in the middle of our country at some point. Yes, there were, for sure. So that was a name given to that Native American tribe back in the colonial days, when the French also were colonizing around the Mississippi River in the middle of the United States. So, so the Lakota Sioux, not that excited about all of the troops and white guys moving into their traditional lands. So George Armstrong Custer had been, he'd been a colonel, and one of you is going to know this, yeah. And he'd been a colonel in the Civil War. He was the youngest promoted to, it's either general or colonel. He's like 25. He's really young. But then when the war's over, we don't need as many officer type folks. So he got demoted, and he wanted to get promoted back. So he needed to do something dramatic to get noticed. So one of the things he wanted to do was help subdue Native Americans and get them back on the reservation. So he kind of got set up by the Lakota Sioux. They drew him in they went off the reservation. They went near the Little Bighorn River. Custer has a messenger who finds out about this and tells him, rather than waiting for the other troops that he's stationed with, he takes his division and goes and says, we can defeat them by ourselves. He anticipates being outnumbered 2-1, but because he has, trained men and superior weapons, he probably did have superior weapons, he figures I'll be fine. He's not. So he gets there, he's outnumbered more 10-1. And apparently, if you read about this, his scouts, who are Crow, the closer they get, they just leave. It's like, yeah, we don't want to die. And Custer and his men are all killed within, it's like 15 minutes, really fast. So they call that Custer's Last Stand. So this will be the only military victory, major military victory for Native Americans in this era. The Sioux would eventually be defeated, and then the Dawes Act. So this is a big part of your question. So here we go, Dawes Act. And this thing's pretty big deal. So the Dawes Act, let me see if I can just, there we go, there we go. So 1887, the Dawes Act, what it does is it's a recognition that even though we, the United States government, killed the buffalo and we've confined Native Americans onto reservations, there's still some things they're not doing right. You know, they're still not civilized. So we got to help them out a little bit more. You know what those crazy Native Americans were doing? You know, we said, hey, you got to be farmers. We got rid of the buffalo and we said, here, plant some crops and harvest them and stuff. They said, okay. So what they did is they lived on one side of the reservation and the other part of the reservation was like a big collective farm. And they all went out, you know, the whole tribe went out and worked on the farm together. And so they split up the crop and the proceeds. And it's like, no, we don't do that. This is the United States of America. We're not communal or maybe, you know, a version of communism either. That's not us. You do this with your family. So what the Dawes Act does is it goes into the farms and it goes into the reservation and splits up the farmland and says, here are the 160 acres for this family. Here are the 160 acres for this family. You guys cannot farm together. You have to farm individually. Plus, we have noticed your kids, they're not right. They don't look right. They don't dress right. Their hair's not right. They're not speaking the right language. They got some weird religion, which we're not cool with. So we're taking your kids away and we're going to send them to boarding schools. So boarding school, it's sort of like not community college, you know, where you go, it's like Angelo State, where you go and you live there and you go to college and you're away from your family, that sort of thing. So they, you know, they have these for kids as well. Probably, I don't know, did any of you go to boarding school? My dad worked at one. It was a military school, Missouri Military Academy. He did the food for them. He was very popular. Everyone likes food. But boarding schools as a rule, not popular. And I'm sure no one liked the food at these. But these things, the goal of the boarding school was to intentionally change the culture of the younger generation. And so you would send them back to the reservation, and then they, as the next group of leaders, would act more like the average white guy, which was the goal. So you would educate them in farming. So they would learn, you know, what to farm, how to farm, what to grow, when to grow it, how to run the farm equipment, how to fix the farm equipment. So it's farm school. Plus, they would make them dress like little white dudes. So they would wear, you know, dungarees, pants, or suit, whatever, to school. They also cut their hair. They weren't allowed to speak any language but English, and they were punished if they didn't. They went to chapel twice a week. So really the goal is to change the culture of Native Americans by redistributing the land, giving everybody a small farm rather than a tribal communal farm, and then take kids to boarding schools where they learned how to be the average white guy. So the two most famous schools are the Carlisle School and the Haskell School. And these typically were nowhere near the reservations, definitely the Pennsylvania School. Super close. Okay, so the intent is to remake culture into something that more resembled the typical white family farm, which is what the vision of the Midwest was. And it is what the Midwest was for a long time. So the end result of this is the destruction of traditional tribal culture. And that is definitely the goal. That's the stated goal of the Dawes Act. So when that happened on purpose. That was not an accident. And the US government and the people that instituted this in general thought that this was a good thing. They thought they were helping to improve the culture of Native Americans. I'm not suggesting at all that it was a good thing or that this in any way justifies it, but I'm just telling you that they knew they were changing the culture. They did that on purpose, and they thought that it would be helpful. And if you're wondering, is this the only country in the world where stuff like this happens? You had world history, you know that it's not. And for whatever reason, when your country's powerful and takes over other people's countries, this is what you do. And again, I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying it's very typical in world history. The only reason I say that is because you know, it's because of the papers that I was reading where the U.S. is the most racist country in history, and I just, I would have a hard time agreeing with you on that, but you are definitely going to see some racist or biased things that happen in the US because people are people, and yeah, because yeah, people are biased sometimes. There's no doubt. I would also suggest to you that things like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, especially the 14th Amendment, my goodness, that guarantees equal protection under the law for everyone. And even parts of Reconstruction where you have African Americans who ascend to political positions in the House and the Senate in DC, who are ambassadors, who start colleges. I mean, you do see opportunities that are unusual and not possible in certain places. However, I would never suggest to you that any of this stuff means that we were achieving equality. It's a slow process, and we're still not there, still working. All right, ghost dance. I'll talk about it really quickly. And you guys feel like we need to talk about this more next week, we can, but I know some of you want to get the question done this week, which is a good plan. So the ghost dance, Wovoka is the guy who I think starts this, and it's really shared by several different tribes in the Great Plains. But it's really just it's a dance. It is. And the thought here is that you would dance until you got a vision, and the vision would be of the white men leaving and the buffalo returning. And that, I mean, that's kind of relevant to the stuff that we just talked about, because the whole goal of destroying the culture started with destroying the buffalo. So the ghost dance is where the buffalo return and the white men leave. And it's a dance. I mean, it's not necessarily an armed resistance movement, but it's definitely a sign that Native Americans were not thrilled that their culture had been changed, that they'd been forced on reservations. So ghost dance movement starts, and you see the end of the ghost dance movement at, sorry, I got distracted. Oh no, I think I meant to do that. I wanted to check the chat because let me type in the name of the guy. And I'm not really sure that your book mentions this guy, because I just don't remember. That's the name of the ghost dance guy. Sorry. Yeah, about a page on the essay questions. I'm just laughing because I don't know why. I'm just laughing. And let me share the question. And I'm sorry. Where's the question? There it is. Okay. All right. So significance of Wounded Knee. So Wounded Knee is the last group instance of the ghost dance, and this is Wounded Knee is North Dakota, I think. So you've got a group of people. I think the most famous guy in this group is a Native American named Bigfoot. It really is, yeah. I think it's Bigfoot. Yeah, because he's the one they have in the pictures. There are actually pictures of the massacre at Wounded Knee, but let me tell you what it was. I'm sorry. So massacre at Wounded Knee, there's a very large instance of the ghost dance celebration. And there's thousands of people who are there dancing. And, you know, the whole goal is the more of them that get this vision that the white men are leaving and the ghost and the buffalo are returning, the more likely it is that the spirit realm will honor that request. So there's thousands of them dancing, and they're all surrounded by US troops because they're on a reservation. And something happens, either a drumbeat that's mistaken for a gunshot, somebody is trying to disarm a Native American and the gun goes off, or the Native American shoots at someone, and nobody knows which one it is. The soldiers are going to say it's the third option, but something happens. And then the troops shoot into the crowd of dancers, and a couple of hundred dancers get killed. And all of them were unarmed. They couldn't have been participating if they were armed. Now, about 100 years later, during the Native American civil rights movement, a group of Native Americans will go and retake Wounded Knee. So when Native Americans talk about the experience at Wounded Knee, this is essentially a peaceful, unarmed protest. It's a group dance, and they get 200, almost 200 folks. I think it's like 180. Get massacred as they're dancing. And the dance really is a protest of the culture that's been forced on them. So it's significant because it's seen as the last large group resistance. I know it's not a battle or anything, but it's a large group resistance to the US government for about 100 years. That really does end uprisings, that kind of stuff. I think somebody in their answer talked about Chief Joseph, and I think your book mentions him too, because he's the one who tries to take Nez Perce, is his tribe, up to, tries to take the Nez Perce out of their reservation and up to Canada, and gets intercepted in the process. There's just tons of sad stories from this time period that you could read if you wanted to, read some depressing stuff. You could. There's a lot of it. Okay, before you go, let me ask a roll question really quick to see if you are here. Do we have Christopher Fresh? If you are that person, you should tell me. I saw a couple of Christophers, but not that one. And Alex Harmon. I always miss somebody, so I feel bad about that. And then Tanya Roman or Roman. And Karamatula. I'm going to assume those people aren't here. All right, if you were one of those people, you got to tell me or type it in the chat. All right, so Dawes Act, when you answer that question, talk about what the Dawes Act does, talk about the goal of the Dawes Act. If you want, you can talk about, the intentional getting rid of the buffalo. There's more specific detail in your textbook. So you should be using your textbook as you answer that. Why not? Just be sure to put it in your own words. And again, feel free to work with other people in the class. You guys can share documents. You guys are much better at that stuff than I am. Feel free to work together. Just don't have the exact same answer. All right, before we go, question maybe. Social Darwinism and workers' rights briefly mentioned. Those, I really did just put the things on the quiz that I listed in the study for the quiz thing. So we are definitely going to talk about social Darwinism more when we talk about the progressive era, and also more about workers' rights. Okay. And you guys share the class Discord, because you can play games and learn about history there. Mostly learn about history. All right. And the Discord server, you guys are sharing that in the chat. Or the link. That's a great idea. Yep. What? There's a game where they refer to Wounded Knee? There's some movie that when we didn't have the STAR test, I used to show to my classes that talked about the Native American rights movement, but it's a weird movie. I can't remember what it was called. This is really old. I'll have to think of that sometime. But yeah, they definitely, the Wounded Knee, it's really kind of a big deal. And if you look up I'd mentioned that there are pictures of dead people. There's some online site where it shows newspaper articles from the time period where they talk about what happened at Wounded Knee, and they do include the photos of the dead dancers in it. Ugh. Goodness. Yeah, they didn't censor their news back then. All right. Anything else you guys want to mention before we go? All right, and let me know if you have questions. I know I may be a little behind on answering emails, but I will catch up on that probably tomorrow. Today's like super full for me, but probably tomorrow, and then I'll grade some more tomorrow as well. You don't have anything officially due until the 18th, but you know, I wouldn't put it all off until the 18th. It's your call, but you do it however you like. All right, questions or comments before we say goodbye? All right, I'm going to say goodbye. Stay behind if you want to ask stuff. I hope you all have a good day, a good weekend. You're productive and safe and all that stuff. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it. Thanks for paying attention. Have a lovely day. Go eat lunch.
Have a nice day.
Thank you too. You guys have a good day. Go on that Discord server, play that game, learn about history. Bye, everyone. All
Hey, I have a
right.
question.
Okay, let's hear it.
How do you say your name? Jane?
Jane, uh-huh.
Jane. Okay, awesome. Would there be an opportunity for us to do a revision to the question?
Oh, maybe.
Yeah, I know you don't want to. I was
Yeah.
thinking about it, and I know you don't want to go through
I know.
30 of them, only
I
do
know
30
that is
revisions,
true.
right?
You know, if for some reason, like the end of the class, you needed 2 points to get the grade you wanted, I would absolutely be open to it. Yeah.
Sure. So, I mean, it was a 9 out of 10, which doesn't bother me very much. It's just kind of how do you think that, not that grade in particular, but the grades of these will impact the final grade? Or is it going to be heavily weighted?
Well, in the section where it talks about grades, it mentions that you have 1 weekly question and they're worth 10 points each.
Okay.
And so there's 3 or 4 of those per unit. So there's 30 or 40 points
And
per
4
unit.
units, so
for the
12, so
weekly.
about 120 points.
Right. And then the quizzes are worth, let's see, no, there's 2 units where you have 3 weekly questions and 2 units where you have 4. So that's 140. There's 140 points available for the weekly questions and 160 points available on the quiz. It says 40 points each unit. So there's 300 points total. And then you can
Okay.
get extra points with the book review. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, that's not too bad. I mean, 270 to 300.
No, you've
Okay.
got a pretty good range. You can lose 30 points. Yeah. I mean, that's a weird way to look at it, but
Yeah.
it's a true way to look at it. You can lose 30 points. So that's good.
And then, so if we do everything, including the quizzes and the reviews, but not the book review, we can't get an A. We have to do the book
You
review.
have to
get
do
an
the
A.
book review to get an A because there's a certain writing requirement, formal writing requirement that, you know, that our department puts on us. But those points are technically extra as well. So you can miss some points and then gain them back in the book review as well, if that
Okay.
makes sense.
Awesome. All right, Jane. Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a lovely day.
You as well. Bye.
Thank you. All right, Harsha, do you have a question or are you just lingering? Oh, I should stop recording.